Welcome to Swallow, a comfortable space where I unpack the significance of written works, from novels and essays to historical texts and scripts. Whether it's a strange play, an article on 20th century ideologies, or your favorite film dialogue, we explore how words and literature shape societies, cultures, and even our own ways of thinking. To enhance your experience, I incorporate soothing background ambience, adding a touch of ASMR that invites you to relax and immerse yourself fully in each episode. No gatekeeping knowledge, just deep dives, interesting stories, and reflections on why words matter. I'm Tando, and I'm so glad you're here. Episodes come out whenever they come out, since this is a no-pressure space where I prioritize quality over quantity. Take a moment to settle in, get comfortable, and be present with me. Breasts and Eggs, an Existential Duty. In this episode, I would like to review a novel that definitely left me with a lot to think about regarding general intimacy, matriarchal families, sexuality, how I view motherhood, and even the inherent or developed desire for children. There is so much I wanted to unpack with this particular novel, but I'm trying to keep to a specific time, so I opted for what I felt were a few good entry points into enjoying this novel holistically. Japanese is not a language I am fluent in, and I've tried my very best to pronounce each name correctly, so I'd also appreciate a bit of patience as I learn and immerse myself and you into this new cultural environment with really, really beautiful names. Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami is what I'd describe as the unavoidable house of mirrors. Its subject matter is difficult to unpack without personal bias and entirely subjective when it boils down to what you, as an individual, want for yourself, from your relationships, and from your body. It's tricky to pinpoint what the story's overriding takeaway is, but I think that's less of a writing issue and more about what the reader might have felt was better for the main protagonist, and whether we even have a say in this conversation. Before we begin the analysis of Breasts and Eggs, I must warn you that this novel has slightly heavy subject matter regarding sex work and minor references to domestic abuse, though I won't be touching on either point. I also warn you that there will be one spoiler in this episode that may or may not affect how you read the novel, but I felt it was too important to leave out due to its significance to the storyline. I've also tried my best to pronounce each name correctly, as I previously said, so please do be gracious if I've made an error, as I'm still familiarizing myself with tone and enunciation. With that being said, let's dive in. On a sweltering summer's day in a poor suburb of Tokyo, we meet three women. 30-year-old Natsuko, her older sister Makiko, and Makiko's teenage daughter Midoriko. Makiko, an aging hostess despairing over the loss of her good looks, has traveled to the city in search of the breast enhancement surgery she thinks will change her life. Accompanying her is Midoriko, who has recently stopped speaking. In Natsuko's rundown apartment, the three women slowly confront their individual anxieties as well as their relationship under the weight of Midoriko's punishing silence. 8 years later, we are reunited with Natsuko. She is now a writer and finds herself on a journey back to her native city, returning to memories of that summer and her family's past as she faces her own uncertain future. A radical and intimate portrait of contemporary working-class womanhood, Breasts and Eggs recounts the heartbreaking journeys of three women in a society where the odds are stacked against them. The novel is divided into two parts. I initially found myself gravitating more toward book 2, particularly because it expands on the intersection of Natsuko's writing career and her complex inner world. We meet Senegawa, her career first editor, Rika Yusa, a writer and single mother, Aizawa, conceived via artificial insemination and searching for his biological father, and Yuriko, who believes her mother's decision to have her was selfish. Book 2 is a focus of a few important narrative arcs: Natsuko's writing block, a faint sense of imposter syndrome, and a building panic about sexuality and motherhood. Even as a published writer, she feels amateurish. It manifests in slight ways, such as in conversation with her editor or in rooms with other writers where conversation feels slightly misaligned, thwarted by hubris and generally ridiculous. As Michael Orthofer observed in the complete review, Kawakami writes with unsettling precision about the body, its discomforts, its appetites, its smells, capturing its longings that are at once obsessive and inchoate, and in one way or another about transformation. It's important to understand that the precision he's referring to isn't confined to the body or physicality. It sits in how rigid her struggle with writing is, how her niece embodies silence, and Natsuko's interpretation of that silence expanding, as well as how she occupies space both creatively and as a woman in a still rather traditional environment. The internal dynamics of this precisiveness turn focally toward motherhood from Book 1 to Book 2, without being apologetic or on the nose about the shift. Sarah Chihaya, writing in the New York Review of Books, notes that Kawakami's narrator rejects the conventional desires a woman is supposed to have, yet cannot or will not say what she might want in their stead. That observation captures the unease of Book 2. Natsuko does not want marriage. She does not crave sexual partnership, yet she begins to feel a pull toward having a child. And through a slightly complex and slow-building relationship with Aizawa, we see that her desires still don't neatly replace the rigid expectations she challenges. In a fascinating but totally authentic way, her want for a child, and possibly for a relationship, arrives awkwardly and without judgment. But to understand that shift, we have to return to Book 1 and observe what I see as a necessary theology in the world of body politics, women's bodies, and soul-mind polarity. The body serves as a beautiful narrative tool in this novel. It's important to note that Makiko works as a hostess in Osaka. In Japan, hostess clubs are nightlife establishments where women are paid to sit with male clients, pour drinks, flirt, and provide conversation and emotional attention. The job revolves around charm, attentiveness, and appearance. Physical contact and sex are not part of the official structure of the work, though the atmosphere is intentionally intimate and performative. Makiko believes at one point that prettiness means value, but some people never experience that personally. For her, the body is economic. It determines her stability and ability to earn more money at the local clubs that she works for, and more intimately, her worth in a market that prioritizes and glorifies a youthful image. Her daughter, Midoriko, is almost on the furthest extreme here. She once wrote in her diary that it feels like I'm trapped inside my body. It decides when I get hungry and when I'll get my period. For her, the body is almost invasive and predatory in its demands. It feels as though she's being held captive by it and that there is a future that she cannot escape. This feeling is not only relatable for any woman, girl, or person who experiences female bodily changes, but serves as a brilliant marker for the other ways that the body becomes a storytelling device. Natsuko exists somewhere between those positions. She reflects later, "My monolithic expectation of what a woman's body was supposed to look like had no bearing on what actually happened to my body." Her body does not function as currency, nor does it act as a betrayal to the spirit. It exists almost neutrally, and that neutrality unsettles Natsuko because she has observed womanhood as something definitive, specific, and loaded with clear decisions. I regard this reflection with a great deal of respect, mostly because she allows herself to sit in that middle space. She doesn't dramatize the absence of desirability, nor does she romanticize it. She sees herself through the changes, the confusion, the discomfort, even the small joys, without forcing them into a grand narrative about what her body should have become. I think sisterhood, oddly enough, becomes a major influence in both this ever-changing narrative of the body and her later perceptions of motherhood. The way Natsuko understands herself physically is inseparable from the women she has grown up alongside. What she has seen happen to their bodies and how they have interpreted those changes also matters. It's almost as though sisterhood feels like a rehearsal for motherhood. I don't mean that Natsuko is already playing the role of a substitute parent or that sisterhood is inherently maternal, but rather that she is present in the tension between Makiko and Midoriko without trying to resolve it. And this is a learned behavior from growing up with Makiko. She pays attention. She notices shifts in tone and atmosphere. She doesn't rush to fill Midoriko's silence, and she doesn't inflame Makiko's anxieties about her body or her relationship with her daughter. Siblinghood is interesting because it equips you with an understanding of how our different roles function. You can swim between being a parent, a friend, or a stranger almost organically and at any given moment. And this transferred from Natsuko being with Makiko to them having Midoriko join them in their little world. It's also worth noting that Natsuko's interest in Midoriko isn't so much about figuring out her silence or trying to dissect it, as much as it is about connecting to her in a way that she herself might have wanted to be understood at that age. She recognizes parts of herself in her niece, but not so pointedly that she collapses the distinction between them. She doesn't project herself onto the girl and allows Midoriko to remain her own person, especially as she is perceiving her. The approach to mothering in this sense is almost exclusively about recognizing one another and learning how to give breadth to that. I also appreciate that she doesn't make a performance out of trying to understand Midoriko's needs. She doesn't position herself as the better adult or the corrective maternal figure. And she also doesn't undermine Makiko's authority in front of her daughter. That restraint says a lot about consideration towards her sister and signals how cognizant she is of the fragility in mother-daughter relationships, just generally speaking. Later, when motherhood becomes a serious possibility for her, that earlier restraint returns with intention for the narrative. She has already seen how complicated that role can be, which influences her considerations around having a child, let alone a daughter. Hey friends, I wanted to take a moment to mention that I have a crowdfunding page for my bookstore, Muscle and Bone Literary. This is a project that means the absolute world to me, and I would truly appreciate it if you could help me bring this to life by donating to the page, sharing the link, or downloading this episode. Picking one or all of these things could help me out so much. There is absolutely no pressure. Details about the bookstore and the link to my crowdfunding page are in the bio. Thank you for your time and love, and please enjoy the rest of this episode. At this point, I wanted to talk about the different ways we could analyze this novel, because I think it benefits from having a framework rather than simply asking whether we agree with Natsuko's choices and what we think of each character, plainly speaking. One way of reading Breasts and Eggs is through what I'd call embodied positionality. Instead of starting with ideology, whether motherhood is good or bad, liberating or oppressive, we start with where each woman stands in relation to her body. Furthermore, how each character views themselves within this foundational structure. For Makiko, whose body functions as currency, everything circles back to livelihood. Her income depends on desirability, And perhaps, though the novel doesn't fully spell this out, the way she sees herself is subverted into her interest in the surgery being a purely work-related desire. Age becomes a financial threat for her, but it does not end at age, does it? And when we think of Midoriko, the invasive nature of the body alludes to puberty and how it feels like something is happening to her rather than with her. We don't know the full story about how this came to be, and I'd argue that her observations of her mother play a role despite not being highlighted in the novel as well. Menstruation becomes evidence of a future she hasn't chosen, and education around this particular topic is still so sparse in schooling and homes, which makes its position in the narrative still so important to the development and articulation of the reader and their ability to challenge what might be or might have previously been similar to Midoriko. With Natsuko, embodied positionality sees us through her understanding of what the body is meant to do versus what it is actually doing. She has been influenced by her sister, mother, and women in the community, and is expecting that her body should grow into the self-assured sexiness. When that transformation never fully materialized, she was left negotiating what that meant for her sense of womanhood. Finally, we're positioned to understand the body as an origin point for existentialism. Aizawa and Yuriko in Book 2 become highly significant to this theme. Their existence begins with reproductive technology. Their bodies are tied to decisions made before they could consent, and yet, both people have contrasting ideas of what this means for existence, the desire for a child, and what it means to be selfish in the context of either. One critique I do have is that Aizawa doesn't feel fully fleshed out in terms of his potential here. His relationship with Natsuko was almost lackluster to me, purely because I couldn't tell what he was thinking, and it had nothing to do with intentional choices made by the author. Yuriko made up for this because she was made overbearingly passionate and assertive, and though I understand the point was to have them be two sides of the same coin, it doesn't feel like her perspective was lost in the grand scheme of the story, especially as it did with Aizawa. He might have been a victim of plot device, for lack of better phrasing. I think Midoriko's previous comment about the future unfolding without her choice also resonates with Yuriko in this case. When you track the novel this way, motherhood also shifts from a moral question to a positional one. Each character's stance on reproduction grows directly from how they inhabit their own body. Another way to approach the novel is what I think of as an inheritance audit. At every turning point, you can ask, what belief about womanhood is being inherited? What is being resisted? And then what is being modified? These questions might sound unreasonably scholastic at face value, but their necessity becomes obvious as we ask them. Natsuko inherits the belief that men leave and women endure. This is fed by the consistent pattern of men, including her father, abandoning the home that she and her family grew up in. And she watched her mother and sister endure similar fates in their own way as parents. She resists the assumption that she must marry or have a romantic relationship with a nuclear family. This, again, develops through her sexuality, career, and identification of self in different phases of her growing up. She modifies the script by considering motherhood outside of partnership, and for a brief moment, considering partnership without compromising on what she will or won't endure. Makiko inherits the idea that beauty equals stability. She clings to it even as it destabilizes her. Midoriko inherits fear of becoming her mother, and by extension, accepting the fate of other Japanese women in poor and struggling communities who rely on their bodies for survival. Her resistance is then executed through silence, and soon, the silence becomes the inheritance that Natsuko rests in, particularly in Book 2, long after Midoriko has grown up and is no longer selectively mute. Reading the novel this way highlights that Natsuko's eventual desire for a child does not appear from nowhere. It develops in tension with everything she has observed or been impacted by. But she is not returning to tradition as some might think. She is negotiating what these things mean for her, and not what they are meant to mean in the framework of her life. She is not in a ritual without exit, nor is she rejecting things without consideration. This commitment to nuance is what makes the novel feel like essential reading for someone who might be in a similar headspace, trying to understand how to define and center themselves in order to consider the validity of external voices. Reading the novel this way highlights that Natsuko's eventual desire for a child does not appear from nowhere. It develops in tension with everything she has observed or been impacted by. She isn't returning to tradition, as some might think. She is negotiating what these things mean for her and not what they are meant to mean in the framework of her life. She isn't in a ritual without exit, nor is she rejecting things without consideration. This commitment to nuance is what makes the novel feel like essential reading, especially for someone who might be in a similar headspace, trying to understand how to define and center themselves in order to consider the validity of external voices and opinions. In closing, here are a few thoughts I've collected. Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami is not the most prolific piece of literature about motherhood, asexuality, sisterhood, or the writing career, but it is important to the broader diaspora of these conversations in the way that it adds value through a modern Japanese cultural lens, in its modest articulations of autonomy, and in how it contributes to an infamously hostile thematic environment, one shaped by societies that value childbearing, relationships, and motherhood in very specific and at times unforgiving ways. The novel, in my humble opinion, is far too long, at least in its English translation. I leave a lot of room for that to be contested, mostly because editing is something I do frequently, and I understand why certain expanses need to remain in a story. Quite a few responses to and analysts of this novel have stated similar sentiments, often suggesting that Book 2, the shorter section, feels stronger and narratively tighter than Book 1, which is longer and considerably slower in its storytelling. Regardless, this book was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and understandably so, given its refreshing outlook. The author has mentioned in interviews that she did not intend for this to be read as feminist text. There is merit in admitting that this was not her conscious decision. However, it is difficult to frame any literary work as void of ideological resonance, especially when its entire architecture invites readers to locate meaning in relation to their lived experiences. Whether Kawakami intended to or not, the novel still occupies feminist terrain, tone, and even ideology by virtue of its groundedness to women's interior lives, especially by humanizing women of color without erasing their struggle and by engaging tensions around duty, autonomy, and the long-debated question of whether creating or refusing to create is selfish. Intersectional feminism concerns itself with these exact concepts. In giving shape to the nuanced thought processes of women like Natsuko, Midoriko, and Makiko, the novel reminds us that intent, consequence, and interpretation can coexist without superlatives. The text does not lose its meaning or precision because something new emerged from the narrative. Books develop organically as paintings do, and this is merely a result of creation. A review in the Sociological Review notes that Kawakami presents such varied reproductive positions that it becomes impossible for the reader not to dwell on how an individual's positionality with respect to class, gender, race, and sexuality tends to shape their experiences. That framing reinforces what the novel's already doing. Motherhood here is shaped by class, by abandonment, Japanese legal and social structure surrounding artificial insemination. Okay, one more time. A review in the Sociological Review notes that Kawakami presents such varied reproductive positions that it becomes impossible for the reader not to dwell on how an individual's positionality with respect to class, gender, race, and sexuality shapes their experiences. That framing reinforces what the novel's already doing. Motherhood here is shaped by class. It's also shaped by abandonment, Japanese legal and social structures surrounding artificial insemination, and even generational reflex. And if we place Kawakami alongside Yuko Shushima and her novel Territory of Light, we begin to notice a broader literary pattern. Japanese women writers examining maternal life without romanticizing it. By the end of the novel, Natsuko's desire for a child feels deliberate instead of impulsive. Which brings us back to that house of mirrors I described at the beginning of this episode. The novel does not tell us what to think about her decision. It shows us how she arrived there. It suggests that autonomy is adaptive in nature, that freedom can include revision, that changing one's mind does not invalidate what came before. For women especially, whose choices are often read as permanent declarations rather than evolving positions, that flexibility matters. I find this to be such an influential thought, that development is not hypocritical, and the right to reconsider is part of what validates autonomy, especially for women. Alright folks, that's a wrap for now. Thank you for tuning in to Swallow. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to show me some love, please download and rate it, as this helps me reach more reading friends. If you'd like to read more about topics like this alongside the arts, social culture, and politics, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Muscle and Bone. If you feel like tipping, my Buy Me a Coffee link is attached in the bio, and I've also got the crowdfunding page for my bookstore project that I'm working on. This has been an analysis of Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami. See you soon, friend. Muscle and Bone Studio.